The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $50, and the biggest man on the lot laughed at him in front of the whole county. Otis Lundgren did not laugh back. He just lowered his hand, the bid already his, and looked at the thing he had bought, a massive old gray iron tractor, floor-scale and imposing, taller than a man at the wheel and long and heavy through the frame. The whole great machine, eaten with rust and painted over in cheap flaking gray, its engine seized solid, its tall steel wheels rotted and locked, a hopeless dead hulk of farm iron that 4 strong men did not want to push, let alone load. A rust-frozen tractor worth little more than scrap weight that 90 grown people had walked past all morning, and that Otis Lundgren had just paid $50 to own. It was a warm, bright Saturday morning, the 9th of June, 1973, at the farm and estate auction on the old Harmon place down off the bottom road below Carroll's Mill in Stell County, Indiana. Otis was 70 years old, lean and straight through the back from a lifetime of close work, just beginning to stoop. With a deeply lined face burned brown by the weather, short white hair under a flat tweed cap, and pale, steady eyes that did not move fast. His hands were broad and thick at the knuckle, a man's hands that had both turned a true thread on a lathe and pulled a dead engine down to its last bolt and built it back to run. Otis Lundgren had built and mended iron for 50 years. Engines and gearing and casting, and before the shops went over to throw away parts, whole machines from the frame up, the man they sent for from 3 towns over when a block cracked or an old machine no one else could read, would not turn over true. It was the kind of lot that comes after a place is broken up. The old Harmon farm had gone empty when the last of them passed, and that spring the holdings were sold off to settle the estate. Most of it was farm iron and household plunder. But the gray tractor was the odd thing on the place. It had not come off any catalog or any dealer's floor at all. Old Harmon's people had bought it cheap from a torn-down barn years back and never once made it run. And it had sat behind the corn crib so long the burdock had grown up through its locked steel wheels. So they dragged it out with a chain and stood it at the edge of the last row, the biggest and most hopeless thing on the place. The man who laughed was Royce Tibbett, who ran the biggest scrap and salvage outfit between the river and the county line. A heavy-set man of 52 in a loud red checked shirt and a wide pale cap, his face clean-shaven and ruddy. A silver buckle the size of a saucer at his belt. $50, Royce said, loud, so the people along the rope could hear it. $50 for a rust-rotted gray plow horse that won't turn over and won't roll. Old-timer, that engine's been seized since before either of us could walk. You can't start it, can't sell it, can't even free those wheels. You just bought yourself the heaviest yard ornament in Stell County. Only it's the size of a hog shed. He coined the name right there, and it stuck to Otis for the rest of that June. The plow horse. The people laughed because Royce laughed, the way a crowd does. Otis stood through it without a change in his face, one broad hand flat on the cold gray iron, and let the laughter pass, the way weather passes a man who has decided to stand in it. Now, if you have ever watched a quiet, capable man get talked over by a loud one, if you have ever known somebody whose skill the world used when it was stuck and forgot the rest of the time, then you already understand what this channel is about, and you might take a second to subscribe. Because the people who stay for stories like Otis's are exactly who Iron Hook Stories was built for. Otis said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that work does not answer to noise. What none of them knew, what Royce Tibbet could not have known, grinning in his good cap, was that Otis had walked the rows an hour before the sale and stopped dead at that tractor, and his whole trade had risen up in him. The crowd saw a rusted hunk of dead farm iron. Otis saw the work. He had laid his hand flat on the frame and read it the way a machine man reads another man's iron. And the gray tractor was no factory machine somebody had let rot. The castings were wrong for any maker he knew. The frame hand forged and filed where a factory would have stamped it, the gearing cut, and fitted one tooth at a time by a hand that had no shop behind it, only patience. This was a one-off, built by a single man, not poured out by the hundreds. And under the cheap flaking gray overpaint along the side of the engine, his thumb had found the ghost of something raised in the metal, a cast plate, painted blind, that the crowd had never thought to scrape. Otis would have it clean before the night was out. And what he found stamped under that paint would change how the whole county remembered a dead man it had buried as a fool. Otis had come up hard. He went to work at 14 for a machinist in the river town, and across the years he made himself into an iron man of the rare kind, the one a body called when an engine seized or a casting cracked, who could lay a hand on a cold machine and feel through the metal how it had been made. His wife Marion had died after a long illness, and they had laid a grown son in the ground from the war before that, and after Marion was gone he lived alone at the edge of town with his tools and his quiet. The county had a use for his hands and no use at all for his opinion. He knew that. He bought the tractor anyway. He bought it because he could read it. A one-off machine is the record of one man's whole mind set down in metal, and a builder who pours his life into one generally signs it somewhere a careless hand will never look. He could not yet have told you whose hands had built this one. But a man does not stay 50 years in a trade by ignoring what his own hands tell him plain. If you've made it this far into Otis's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He let them sell the machinery and the farm iron, and he waited. When the auctioneer finally got to the gray tractor and asked $5 to start it, the crowd laughed. Royce called out his joke about the plow horse, and not one other hand went up. Otis raised one finger, and the gavel came down at 50. It took both auction helpers, a chain, and a borrowed loader to drag the locked hulk up onto a flatbed, and Otis drove the 11 miles home at 20 miles an hour, a whole lifetime of patience riding in the cab with him. The story got around Stell County before Otis's flatbed was off the bottom road. By Monday, people who had not spoken 20 words to him in years stopped him outside the feed store to ask, grinning, how the plow horse was running. Merle Apgar, who ran the grain elevator, said it plainer than the rest, that there was nothing to a seized old farm tractor but rust and dead weight and a long haul to the scrap man. Otis was buying a wire brush and a can of solvent and did not look up. "We'll see," he said, and that was the whole of his answer. He had spent 50 years learning that a thing is either made true or it isn't, and the noise a crowd makes has nothing to do with which. But Otis did not scrape it down the night he brought it home. For the better part of a week, the great tractor stood braced on heavy blocks on the floor of his back shop, and every evening after supper he gave it an hour, learning the thing before he laid a hard tool to it, wiping the burdock and grease off the castings. Working at the cheap gray overpaint under a strong lamp, while down at the diner they asked if he'd gotten his plow horse to pull yet. The Harmon Bottoms had their own short, bitter memory, and the county had let it go soft with the years. It ran back further than old Harmon to the man the tractor had truly come from, a back-road farmer inventor named Eli Farrow, who had lived alone up a hard lane decades before and spent every spare hour and dollar building machines in his barn. The county had written him off as a fool in his own lifetime, a tinkering crank who let his fields go to weed while he filed gears by lamplight, who swore he could build a better tractor by hand than the dealers sold, and was laughed out of every store in town for saying it. He died broke and alone, the talk went, with nothing to show for it but a barn full of half-built iron, and after he was gone his one finished machine was sold off cheap to settle his debts, his drawings scattered, and the little dirt floor foundry behind the barn burned to the ground one dry autumn and was never raised again. Otis had been almost a boy when Eli Farrow died, and had once seen a machine the old crank built run clean across a field while the town stood back and snickered. Otis had never thought him a fool, only a man born too far from any shop that would have him, carrying a gift the county had no patience for. What none of the rest of them ever asked was what becomes of a man's whole life's work when the man is laughed into the ground before it is finished. The answer had been bolted under a cast-iron panel on that tractor the whole time, behind iron too heavy to steal and too rusted to want. On the sixth evening, the lamp set so the light fell square along the engine. Otis took a soft brass scraper and a rag of solvent and began to lift the last of the cheap gray overpaint off the raised place his thumb had found, slow and careful, the way you clean a thing you mean to read and not deface. The blind paint came away in soft curls, and under it, raised proud in the old casting, a hand-stamped maker's plate came up into the lamplight, not a factory transfer, but letters a man had cut and cast himself. Something in his chest went very quiet and very sure. A man does not cast his own name into a machine and then let the world paint over it for nothing. He cleaned the plate down to bare metal and read it under the lamp. It carried a maker's name cast in plain block letters, Farrow, and a bill date from decades back. And beneath that, stamped deep and square by a steel die, struck one character at a time, the thing that stopped his breath. No. One. The first one. Not the 40th off a line, not a model in a catalog, the first and only machine a single man had ever finished, signed by his own hand in the iron the way a man signs the one thing he is proudest of. Otis sat back on his stool and looked a long moment at a dead crank's name coming up clean out of a $50 hulk the whole county had buried as junk. But the plate was only half of it. A man who had built machines all his life knew that a careful builder keeps more than a nameplate, and Otis had marked, while he sounded the frame, one cast-iron panel low under the seat that rang wrong. Not hollow with rust, but heavy and packed, and held not by the rough, rusted hardware of the rest of the machine, but by rivets set close and even, peened over and painted blind, by a hand that meant that one panel never to be opened by accident. He went at it slow. He would not take a torch to it. Heat would ruin whatever was sealed behind it. Instead, he drilled the peened rivet heads out one at a time, careful and even, the way the man who set them must have riveted it shut. The cold lived in his old knuckles like weather, but his hands did not shake because a man who has done close work 10,000 times does it long after the rest of him has gotten old. He worked the last rivet free and eased the heavy cast panel off. Careful not to gouge the seat casting, listening to the iron give, until a little before 11 the sealed compartment under the seat came open at last under the lamp. The cavity behind the panel was deep and dry and dark, lined with old waxed cloth against the damp, and it was not empty. Packed careful and square inside, wrapped against the ears, was everything a forgotten man had sealed into the one machine he ever finished, sitting whole where no creditor and no scrap man would ever reach it. Otis stood with his hand on the cut rivet line and looked into the belly of a $50 tractor the county had laughed at as junk. He took the things out one at a time under the lamp, handling each like something another man had trusted to the dark for years. There were 3 kinds of things sealed in that iron, and the first was the proof of the machine itself. A second cast plate, a spare struck from the same die, stamped Faro and No. One to match the one on the engine, the maker's own duplicate, set aside so that even if the machine were stripped and repainted, the record of what it was could not be wholly erased. With it, a folded patent drawing and a sheaf of dimensioned sketches in a cramped square hand, the design set down plain, worth a great deal to the right collector, and more than money to a museum, the only surviving record of a lost one, off built by hand. The second thing was the logbook. A thick hand kept builder's book, the pages ruled and filled in that same square hand. Not a farmer's tally at all, but one man's whole account of the making, every casting poured and refiled, every gear cut and recut, the dates running back across years of nights, and at the front, written careful, the maker's full name, the build date, and the words first machine, No. 1, built entire by my own hand, no shop, no help. Folded in with it, in that same hard hand, was a single sheet headed to whoever finds her and the rest. Otis set that sheet aside unread for the moment, because it felt like a thing a stranger ought to come to last. The third thing was the letter, one folded page, sealed in its own envelope and set upright at the front of the cavity where a man would see it first when the iron came open. And on the outside, in that same hard square hand, it said only, to whoever opens this, if the town never would. Otis worked the envelope open and read what a dead man had written for whoever reached it. Eli Faro wrote that he had spent his life building machines because it was the one thing in all the world his hands knew how to do, and that he had done it alone, in a barn, by lamplight, because no shop in the county would have a back road farmer who had never served a proper apprenticeship. He had built this tractor, his first finished machine, entire by his own hand, cast it, cut it, fitted it, made it run true across his own field, and the town had laughed at it the same as they laughed at him, called him a crank wasting good years on iron that would never amount to anything. He knew, he wrote, that when he was gone, the machine would be sold off cheap and his drawings scattered and his name forgotten, because that is what a county does with a man it has decided is a fool. So he had cast a spare plate and copied out the whole record of the build and sealed it, with his logbook and his letter, into the one place a buyer would never trouble to open. The panel under the seat riveted shut and painted blind, so that some day, if any hand ever came that could read the machine for what it was, that hand would find the proof entire, and know that a forgotten man had built something true. He asked, plain, that the machine be kept whole and not scrapped, his name set right with whoever cared to hear it, and the record given to people who would understand a machine and not melt it. Below his name he had written it out, I built her right, and I signed her, so that being forgotten could never be the same as never having been. Otis read it twice through, and the only man in Stell County who had ever thought Eli Faro built something true now held the proof of it in 2 hands. The next morning, Otis went to the county and asked who had handled the old Faro estate all those years back, and over the better part of a month they traced down what kin the inventor had left, a granddaughter of his line. The last of the Faros, a careworn woman of about 52 named Della Faro Ketman, married and moved off 2 counties over, who had grown up hearing her people called the Crank's family and long ago stopped saying the name out loud. Otis did not sell the plate or the drawings out from under her and did not keep a thing for himself, and a few in town thought him a fool a second time. He let them. Word came back through the county museum first, because Otis had carried the logbook and the spare plate to the curator before he ever thought of money, and the curator had gone very still over the ruled pages and said quietly that there was no other like it known anywhere. A complete, signed, one-off machine with its maker's own build record intact was the kind of thing a museum waits a lifetime for and never sees. A collector of early farm machinery, written to next, offered for the tractor and its papers a sum that made the whole Harmon auction look like pocket change. And Della Faro Ketman came up to Carroll's mill on a gray morning that July, and when Otis laid her grandfather's letter and his builder's logbook on the table and she read them through, she put one hand flat over her mouth and her eyes filled, and she did not say anything for a long time. She had grown up half believing the town's story, that her people had thrown away good years on foolishness and left nothing but a bad name, and the logbook told her instead that the foolishness had been a true machine built true, signed by a man who knew exactly what he had made and how the world would treat it. She asked to meet the man who had opened it, and Otis came to the door in his shirt sleeves while she thanked him with her voice shaking, and all he said was that her grandfather had built that machine to last and signed it so it could not be wholly lost, and that things signed that careful generally do outlast the men who laughed. That summer the tractor and the maker's record went where the family wanted them, and not one person in the county ever again called Eli Faro a crank who wasted his life. Word of it went around Stell County the same way the laughter had, only quieter, and the people who had called Otis a fool let the name the plow horse drop and did not pick it up again. Royce Tibbet was not run out of the county and was not made a villain. He was simply a man who had laughed loud at a thing he did not understand, and the next time he held court at the diner the others did not lean in so far. Otis never said a word against him. Being right was the whole of what he had wanted, and it had brought a forgotten man's name back up out of the dirt. The family kept the tractor where the town could see it. They would not have it scrapped or melted down. With the museum's blessing, it went on a low stand inside the county museum hall, the great gray machine standing whole and sound, the maker's plate cleaned bright, and the no. One plain to read, and Della's people told whoever came through that the rust and cheap gray paint on the outside was what the hard years and a hard town had made of Eli Faro, and what he had signed and sealed on the inside was what he had been the whole time underneath. And on a still evening that next summer, the light going gold across the bottoms. Otis Lundgren drove over to look in on the machine, and there in the last of the sun stood the great gray tractor, whole and cleaned and standing again, the maker's plate catching the light where a stranger's hand had finally read it true. Otis was 70 years old, a man the county had laughed at one whole June, and he stood quiet a long moment and laid one broad, careful hand flat on the cool gray iron and nodded once, the way a man nods at a job that was done right. The work had said it for him, the way work always did. A man signs his work and seals it where only a true hand will ever find it. So that being forgotten can never be the same as never having been. And the world rarely knows what was built true in the hard years until somebody troubles to read what no one else would. So I'll leave it to you. Was Otis Lundgren right to hand back every dollar of it without keeping a cent for himself? Or was that one decency too far, in a world that had laughed at him for nothing? Tell me which one in the comments, and I'll read them.